They hunted in darkness, masters of the deep, terror of the Atlantic. German U-boat commanders believed the night was their shield, the surface their sanctuary. For years, they surfaced under moonless skies to recharge batteries, confident in their invisibility. They were wrong. 30 miles away, invisible eyes watched their every move. Allied radar had turned the hunter into the hunted, and the U-boat captains never knew until it was too late. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Picture this, a steel cylinder cutting through black water, diesel engines rumbling as it rises from the depths. The captain stands on the conning tower, scanning the horizon with binoculars. Nothing. Only darkness stretching in every direction. He believes he is alone, unseen, untouchable. But high above, radio waves are already painting his position on a glowing screen. Aircraft are being vectored toward him. Warships are changing course. His fate is sealed, and he stands there breathing the salt air, completely unaware. How did technology shift the balance of an entire war? What hubris kept German naval command from seeing the truth? And why did thousands of submariners continue surfacing night after night, sailing straight into an invisible net that would claim their lives? To understand how the masters of undersea warfare became sitting ducks on the surface, we must journey back to a time when Germany ruled the Atlantic waves with iron fists and steel torpedoes. We must understand the machine, the men, and the doctrine that made them believe they were invincible. Only then can we grasp the magnitude of their blindness and the brilliance of the technology that exposed them. The Atlantic Ocean in 1939 was not merely water. It was a battleground, a lifeline, a graveyard. For Britain, isolated from continental Europe after the fall of France, the ocean represented survival itself. Every ton of food, every gallon of fuel, every rifle and bullet needed to continue the war had to cross 3,000 miles of hostile water. The convoys that carried these supplies were Britain's jugular vein, and Germany knew exactly where to cut. The weapon chosen for this task was the undersea boat, the U-boat, a creation of engineering brilliance and tactical innovation. These submarines were not the massive nuclear vessels of modern warfare but cramped steel tubes barely 200 feet long, powered by diesel engines on the surface and electric motors beneath the waves. Inside, 50 men lived in conditions that defied imagination. The air reeked of diesel, unwashed bodies, and the chemical stench of battery acid. Bunks were shared in rotation. Privacy did not exist. Every surface dripped with condensation. Food rotted within days. Yet these men volunteered, driven by duty, ideology, and the promise of glory. The U-boat was designed around a single principle: strike from beneath, vanish into the depths. Submerged, it could approach a convoy undetected, fire its torpedoes, and slip away before escorts could respond. On the surface, it possessed speed and range that underwater travel could never match. But therein lay a crucial vulnerability that would take years to exploit. Submarines of this era were not true underwater vessels. They were surface ships capable of diving. Their diesel engines, powerful and efficient, could only operate when drawing air from above. Submerged, running on battery power alone, a U-boat's speed dropped to a crawl, and its endurance measured in hours rather than days. To patrol effectively, to chase convoys, to travel across the vast Atlantic, U-boats needed to spend most of their time on the surface. At night, they surfaced not by choice but by necessity, recharging batteries that had been drained during daylight submersion. This pattern became doctrine. Surface at night when darkness provided cover. Dive at dawn when aircraft could spot them. It was a rhythm as predictable as the tides, and for the first years of the war, it worked beautifully. German naval strategy was built on the teachings of one man, Admiral Karl Donitz. A U-boat commander during the First World War, Donitz had been captured and imprisoned after his submarine was sunk in 1918. During his captivity, he spent countless hours analyzing why Germany had lost the undersea war. His conclusion was brutally simple: Germany had spread its submarines too thin, hunting alone, achieving isolated kills. The solution, he believed, was to concentrate force. Pack tactics. Wolf packs. When Adolf Hitler appointed Dönitz as commander of the submarine fleet in 1935, he was given a chance to test his theories. By 1939, when war erupted, Dönitz had refined his doctrine into a lethal system. U-boats would patrol in coordinated groups. When one spotted a convoy, it would not attack immediately but shadow the target, radioing its position to headquarters. Dönitz himself, operating from command centers first in Germany and later in France, would coordinate the response. Other U-boats would converge on the reported position. When enough had gathered, they would attack simultaneously, overwhelming the escorts with sheer numbers. At night, surfaced and fast, the U-boats would penetrate the convoy's defensive screen. Their low profiles made them nearly impossible to spot against the dark water. They would fire torpedoes at close range, often from within the convoy itself, then race away on the surface faster than most escort vessels could pursue. It was devastation on an industrial scale. In the early years, a single wolf pack could sink a dozen merchantmen in one night. The statistics told a grim story. In 1940, U-boats sank over 1,000 Allied ships. Churchill later wrote that the U-boat peril was the only thing that ever truly frightened him during the war. If the convoys stopped sailing, Britain would starve. If Britain fell, the war in Europe was lost. Everything hinged on defeating the submarines. Yet the U-boat crews themselves felt invincible. They had reasons for their confidence. Early in the war, British anti-submarine technology was primitive. Sonar, then called ASTIC, could detect submerged submarines but was nearly useless against surface targets. Radar existed but was crude, short-ranged, and unreliable. Aircraft carried depth charges but had to visually spot a submarine first, a near impossible task at night or in poor weather. Surface escorts were too few, too slow, and too poorly equipped. The numbers reflected this imbalance. In 1940 and 1941, U-boat losses were minimal. Crews completed patrol after patrol, racking up tonnage totals that earned them medals and fame. Captains like Gunther Prehn, who had boldly penetrated the British naval base at Scapa Flow and sunk the battleship Royal Oak, became national heroes. Otto Kretschmer, Wolfgang Luth, and others achieved ace status, their names celebrated in propaganda. The U-boat service was seen as an elite force, glamorous despite the hardships, a brotherhood of warriors striking decisive blows against the enemy. This culture of invincibility bred dangerous assumptions. German submariners were taught to trust their instincts, to rely on the darkness, to believe that if they could not see the enemy could not see them. Lookouts scanned the horizon with binoculars, searching for the silhouettes of ships or the exhaust plumes of aircraft. If they saw nothing, they assumed they were safe. The idea that they could be detected by invisible means, from distances beyond visual range, seemed like science fiction. German naval intelligence was aware that the Allies were developing radar technology. Captured equipment and interrogated prisoners provided clues. But the intelligence assessments were fatally flawed. German experts believed that radar powerful enough to detect a submarine's small conning tower from significant distances would require massive antennas and equipment far too large for aircraft to carry. They assumed that ship-based radar might pose a threat but that aircraft radar was years away from being practical. This assumption was reinforced by their own experiences. Germany had developed radar as well, primarily for use by surface ships and coastal defenses. Their sets were bulky and had limited resolution. When German engineers tried to miniaturize radar for aircraft use, they encountered significant technical challenges. Extrapolating from their own difficulties, they concluded that the Allies faced the same limitations. They were catastrophically wrong. British scientists, driven by desperation and innovation, had made preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Breakthroughs that German intelligence never anticipated. The key was the cavity magnetron, a device invented in 1940 by John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham. This seemingly innocuous piece of technology revolutionized radar by allowing the generation of high-frequency microwaves in a compact, efficient form. Higher frequencies meant better resolution and smaller antennas. Suddenly, radar sets that could detect small targets at long ranges could be built light enough to fit inside aircraft. By 1941, British bombers and patrol aircraft were being equipped with ASV Mark II radar, standing for air-to-surface vessel. The sets were still primitive by later standards, but they worked. On a good night, an operator could detect a surfaced U-boat from 10 miles away. By 1942, improved versions pushed that range to 15, then 20 miles. The Mark III, using centimetric wavelength technology derived from the cavity magnetron, could detect targets at 30 miles with startling clarity. The impact was immediate and devastating, though the Germans did not yet understand why. U-boats that surfaced at night began reporting sudden attacks by aircraft that appeared without warning. Captains described being caught on the surface with no prior indication of danger. One moment, the lookouts saw nothing. The next, an aircraft roared out of the darkness, searchlights blazing, depth charges falling. There was no time to dive. The first warning was often the last. At first, the U-boat command attributed these incidents to bad luck or improved visual spotting techniques. Perhaps the Allies were using infrared detectors or had developed better night vision. Some theorized that Allied aircraft were using sound detection, listening for the rumble of diesel engines. Others suggested that spies or intercepted radio transmissions were giving away U-boat positions. The possibility that aircraft could see them electronically, from beyond the horizon, was not seriously considered. The psychological effect on the crews was profound. Submariners are accustomed to danger, but danger they can understand. Depth charges, torpedoes, gunfire, these were tangible threats that could be evaded or endured. But attacks that came without warning, from an enemy they never saw, were something else entirely. It felt like being hunted by ghosts. The darkness, once their ally, now seemed filled with invisible watchers. Captains began altering their procedures. Some posted extra lookouts, doubling or tripling the number of men scanning the skies. Others reduced surface time, diving more frequently even though it hampered operational effectiveness. A few even began surfacing during the day, gambling that visual detection was less dangerous than whatever was finding them at night. But nothing worked. The attacks continued. The turning point came not from German insight but from British carelessness. In early 1943, a German search team investigating the wreckage of a shot-down British bomber discovered intact radar equipment among the debris. When scientists examined the device, they were stunned. The cavity magnetron technology was far beyond what they had believed possible. The set was small, powerful, and operating on wavelengths they had assumed were impractical for airborne use. Even then, the response was muddled. Donitz was briefed on the findings, but the implications were not fully grasped. Instead of fundamentally altering U-boat tactics, the focus shifted to developing countermeasures. Engineers rushed to create radar warning receivers that could detect the signals being transmitted by Allied radar. These devices, called METOX and later Naxos, were distributed to U-boats with instructions to surface only when the receivers indicated. No radar was nearby. But the countermeasures were flawed from the start. The METOX receiver could detect some Allied radar signals but not all. The newer centimetric radars, like the ASV Mark III, operated on frequencies outside METOX's detection range. U-boat captains, believing they were safe because their warning receiver showed no contacts, surfaced confidently, only to be caught by radars they could not detect. Worse, the Germans began to suspect that the Allies were homing in on the METOX receivers themselves, using the emissions from the German equipment to locate U-boats. This paranoid theory, though false, led to the devices being turned off or used sparingly, leaving the submarines blind once again. The confusion within the U-boat arm was complete. They knew they were being detected but not how. Every theory was tested, every countermeasure deployed, yet the losses mounted. By mid-1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively against Germany. U-boats that once sank hundreds of thousands of tons per month were themselves being sunk faster than they could be replaced. In May 1943 alone, Germany lost 41 U-boats, a staggering figure that forced Donuts to temporarily withdraw his forces from the North Atlantic entirely. The hunters had become the hunted, and the weapon that accomplished this reversal was invisible, silent, and utterly merciless. The men who crewed the U-boats were not monsters or fanatics. They were sailors, many of them young, some barely out of their teenage years, thrust into a war they did not start. They came from all corners of Germany, farm boys from Bavaria, factory workers from the Ruhr, students from Berlin. What united them was a sense of duty, a belief that they were defending their homeland against encirclement and destruction. Training was rigorous and unforgiving. Recruits spent months at shore facilities learning every system, every procedure, every contingency. They practiced escape drills, damage control, and silent running. They memorized the layout of their assigned boat until they could navigate it blindfolded. The washout rate was high. Only those who demonstrated absolute competence and unshakable nerve were assigned to operational boats. Once at sea, the reality exceeded the worst warnings of their instructors. The interior of a Type 7 U-boat, the most common model, was barely habitable. The pressure hull measured just over 20 feet in diameter, and nearly every inch was packed with equipment. Torpedoes lined the walls. Diesel engines dominated the central compartment, roaring so loudly that conversation was impossible when running on the surface. The batteries that powered the electric motors filled the bilges beneath the deck plates, constantly emitting hydrogen gas that could explode if ignited by a careless spark. Sleeping arrangements were absurd. There were fewer bunks than men, a practice called hot bunking where exhausted sailors rotated through the same narrow racks. The galley could barely be called a kitchen, a single stove wedged into a corner where the cook prepared meals for 50 men from rapidly dwindling supplies. Fresh food lasted a week at most. After that, it was canned meat, hard bread, and whatever could be preserved. Mold grew on everything. Rats, stowaways from the docks, scurried through the compartments. The smell was legendary. Diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, spoiled food, backed-up toilets, and the ever-present stench of battery acid combined into a miasma that clung to clothing and skin. Men returning from patrol could be identified by the smell alone, a reek that took weeks to wash away. It was said that a submariner could find his boat in a pitch-black harbor simply by following his nose. Yet camaraderie flourished in these hellish conditions. The crew was small enough that every man knew every other. Rank mattered during duty, but in the cramped quarters, officers and enlisted men shared the same misery and developed a bond deeper than most military units ever achieved. The captain was not a distant authority but a leader who ate the same foul food, breathed the same poison air, and shared the same fate if the boat went down. And boats did go down. With terrifying regularity. A depth charge exploding close aboard could rupture the hull, flooding compartments faster than watertight doors could be sealed. A single torpedo from an escort could send a U-boat to the bottom in seconds, taking all hands with it. Diving too deep, beyond the boat's rated depth, could cause the pressure hull to implode, killing everyone instantly in a catastrophic compression that left no survivors and no wreckage. The fear of drowning haunted every submariner. They knew the statistics. If their boat was sunk, their chances of survival were minimal. Submerged attacks left no time to escape. Surface attacks might allow some men to reach the water, but in the North Atlantic, exposure killed within minutes. Lifeboats and rafts were often destroyed in the attack or swept away in the chaos. Rescue was unlikely. Allied ships and aircraft were under orders not to stop for survivors, lest they themselves be torpedoed by other U-boats. Despite these odds, morale remained high during the early years. Victories were frequent, targets were plentiful, and losses were light. The propaganda machine ensured that successful captains were celebrated. Newsreels showed grinning crews returning to port, decks festooned with pennants representing ships sunk. Bands played, crowds cheered, and girls threw flowers. For young men raised on stories of heroism and sacrifice, it seemed a noble calling. But as the war dragged on and the Allies' technological advantage grew, the reality became undeniable. Patrols that once lasted weeks now ended in hours. Boats that survived one mission were sunk on the next. Replacement crews arrived at training facilities younger and less experienced, rushed through abbreviated courses to fill the gaps left by the dead. Veterans who completed multiple patrols were viewed with awe, not because of their skill but because of their sheer luck in surviving. The captains bore the heaviest burden. They were responsible not only for the success of the mission but for the lives of 50 men crammed into their steel coffin. Every decision carried weight. Surface or stay submerged. Attack or evade. Press on or turn back. A captain's judgment determined whether his crew returned to port or vanished into the depths. And increasingly, no matter what decisions they made, U-boats were being lost. Among these captains was a man named Reinhard Suren, commander of U-564. Suren was an experienced officer, methodical and cautious. He had completed multiple patrols and earned the respect of his crew. In early 1943, he was ordered to patrol the mid-Atlantic, hunting the convoys that supplied Britain. It was a routine assignment, the kind he had executed many times before. U-564 departed from its base in Brest, France, slipping out of the harbor at dusk. The boat ran on the surface through the Bay of Biscay, a stretch of water heavily patrolled by Allied aircraft. The crossing was tense. Lookouts scanned the skies constantly, knowing that a single plane could end everything. Suren ordered frequent crash dives, submerging at the slightest hint of danger. But the METOX receiver showed nothing. No radar signals. No indication they were being watched. After 2 days, they reached the open Atlantic and began their patrol. For a week, U-564 cruised on the surface at night, searching for targets. The lookouts saw nothing but empty ocean. Radio intercepts indicated that convoys were passing through the area, but locating them was proving difficult. Suren was patient. He knew that persistence often paid off. On the 8th night, just after midnight, disaster struck without warning. Suren was in the conning tower, scanning the horizon with binoculars. The sea was calm, visibility good. Stars filled the sky. The METOX receiver sat silent in its cradle. There was no indication of danger. Then, suddenly, a roar of engines. Suren's head snapped up. A twin-engine aircraft, a British Wellington bomber, was diving toward them from astern, so close that he could see the exhaust flames from its engines. There was no time to dive. Suren shouted the alarm, but the aircraft was already overhead. A searchlight blazed on, bathing the U-boat in harsh white light. Depth charges fell, for dark shapes tumbling from the bomber's belly. Suren and the lookouts threw themselves down the hatch as the explosions erupted around the boat. Water and shrapnel hammered the hull. The boat shuddered, rolling hard to starboard. Below, the crew scrambled to their stations. The diving alarm was already sounding, but the damage was done. Water poured through torn seals. Electrical circuits sparked and shorted. One of the diesel engines was blown off its mounts, a twisted wreck blocking the passageway. Suren ordered emergency procedures, but it was clear the boat was crippled. They managed to limp on the surface for another hour before a second aircraft found them and delivered the finishing blow. Suren gave the order to abandon ship. U-564 sank stern first, taking 3 men with it. The survivors spent 6 hours in the water before being picked up by a British destroyer. Suren's experience was not unique. Across the Atlantic, U-boats were being caught in identical fashion. Captains reported the same pattern: no warning, no detection, just sudden attack from aircraft that seemed to materialize out of nowhere. The psychological toll was immense. How could they fight an enemy they could not see? How could they evade detection when they did not know they were being detected? Back at U-boat headquarters, Donitz reviewed the reports with growing alarm. The monthly loss rates had been climbing steadily, but the spike in early 1943 was catastrophic. In March, 15 boats were lost. In April, 16. In May, the number soared to 41. At this rate, the U-boat force would be annihilated within months. Something had changed, something fundamental, and don'ts needed answers. Intelligence officers were tasked with investigating every possibility. They examined wreckage recovered from downed Allied aircraft, interrogated captured aircrews, and analyzed every scrap of information. Slowly, the pieces began to fit together. The Allies had radar, powerful radar, mounted in aircraft and small enough to be effective. The cavity magnetron technology captured from the crashed bomber confirmed it. But even with this knowledge, the German response was inadequate. Instead of withdrawing U-boats from areas where air cover was heavy, or fundamentally changing tactics to minimize surface time, the High Command doubled down on countermeasures. New radar detectors were developed and rushed into production. Anti-aircraft armament on U-boats was increased, turning some boats into floating gun platforms bristling with cannons. The idea was that if aircraft found them, the U-boats would fight back rather than dive. This decision was disastrous. U-boats were not designed for surface combat with aircraft. Their anti-aircraft guns were effective only at close range, and by the time an aircraft was close enough to engage, it had already dropped its weapons. The extra guns and ammunition took up space and added weight, reducing diving speed and making the boats less maneuverable. Crews that stayed on the surface to fight were slaughtered. Aircraft attacked from angles the guns could not cover, or simply circled out of range while calling in surface ships to finish the job. The losses mounted. By the end of 1943, the life expectancy of a U-boat on patrol had dropped to just weeks. The Wolfpack tactics that had once terrorized the Atlantic were abandoned. Boats now operated alone, trying to evade rather than attack. Morale collapsed. Crews went to sea knowing they were unlikely to return. Some boats were sunk on their first patrols, their inexperienced crews never even seeing an enemy ship. Yet still, the captains did not fully understand why they were being detected. Even with radar detectors, even with the knowledge that radar existed, the operational reality did not sink in. They continued to surface at night, believing darkness provided some measure of protection. They continued to trust their lookouts, unaware that human eyes were useless against electronic surveillance. The invisible enemy remained invisible, its mechanisms mysterious, its reach unknown. In the winter of 1943, U-Boat Command issued new directives. Captains were ordered to minimize radio transmissions, to avoid predictable patrol routes, to dive at the first sign of aircraft. But these measures were half-steps, adaptations rather than revolutions. The fundamental flaw remained: U-boats needed to surface to operate effectively, and when they surfaced, Allied radar found them. The technology gap could not be bridged by tactics or willpower. The Battle of the Atlantic was lost, and the men in the U-boats were the last to realize it. The war continued, and U-boats continued to sail, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Thousands more submariners would die in the remaining years, victims of a weapon they could not see and could not escape. The darkness that once sheltered them had become their grave, illuminated by invisible light and measured in miles they never knew existed. The spring of 1943 marked a watershed moment in naval warfare, though its full significance would not be understood for months. Allied shipping losses, which had peaked at over 700,000 tons in November 1942, began a steep decline. Simultaneously, U-boat casualties soared to unprecedented levels. The mathematics of attrition had reversed. Where once 10 merchantmen died for every U-boat lost, now 2 U-boats were destroyed for every cargo ship sunk. The equation was unsustainable, and yet German Naval Command seemed paralyzed, unable to accept what the numbers were screaming. Admiral Donitz, architect of the Wolfpack strategy and true believer in the U-boat's decisive potential, faced an impossible dilemma. His submarines were being massacred, yet withdrawing them entirely would hand the Allies complete control of the Atlantic. The flow of men and materials to Britain would become a flood. The planned invasion of France, whenever it came, would be unstoppable. Germany's only hope of negotiating anything less than unconditional surrender depended on maintaining pressure on Allied supply lines. So the boats continued sailing, and the men continued dying. The operational reports landing on Donat's desk painted a picture of systematic annihilation. U-boats were being caught on the surface with numbing regularity. Aircraft attacks accounted for the majority of losses, often in areas where air cover had previously been minimal or non-existent. The Bay of Biscay, once a relatively safe passage for U-boats transiting to and from French bases, had become a killing ground. Submarines attempting to cross the bay were hunted relentlessly by British Coastal Command aircraft equipped with the latest radar and equipped with powerful searchlights, rockets, and improved depth charges. Captured Allied aircrew, when interrogated, spoke freely about their equipment. They described radar sets that could detect a conning tower from 20 or 30 miles away, displays that showed the target's bearing and range with precision sufficient to guide an attack in total darkness. German intelligence officers transcribed these accounts and forwarded them up the chain of command, but the institutional response remained sluggish. Part of the problem was psychological. Admitting that Allied technology had leapfrogged ahead meant acknowledging German inferiority in a critical domain, an uncomfortable truth for a regime that prided itself on scientific and engineering prowess. Technical experts were consulted. They confirmed that the captured radar equipment represented a genuine breakthrough. The cavity magnetron technology enabled centimetric wavelengths that German researchers had considered impractical. But knowing the enemy possessed superior radar and effectively countering it were two different challenges. Germany's own radar development had focused on different priorities: naval fire control and early warning systems for defending against bomber raids. The notion of miniaturized, high-resolution radar for hunting submarines had not been pursued with anywhere near the same urgency. Efforts to develop effective countermeasures floundered. The Naxos radar detector, introduced in late 1943, could theoretically detect centimetric radar emissions. In practice, its performance was erratic. Range was limited, often less than the effective range of the radar it was supposed to detect. False alarms were common, caused by atmospheric conditions or the boat's own equipment. Most critically, by the time a U-boat's Naxos receiver picked up a radar signal, the aircraft was often already too close to evade. The warning came not with enough time to dive safely, but merely enough time to realize death was imminent. Some U-boats were fitted with radar-absorbent coatings, special paints and coverings designed to scatter or absorb radar waves. Tests in controlled conditions showed promise, but at sea, the effects were marginal at best. Saltwater corrosion degraded the coatings rapidly. The conning tower, the most prominent feature and thus the primary radar target, could not be fully covered without interfering with lookouts and equipment. And even if a coating reduced radar signature by 50%, that still left the U-boat detectable at 15 miles instead of 30, hardly a decisive advantage. Others proposed more radical solutions. Engineers designed schnorkel devices, retractable tubes that would allow diesel engines to run while the boat remained submerged just below the surface. The concept was sound: submarines could recharge batteries without fully surfacing, but implementation lagged. Existing U-boats had to be retrofitted, a time-consuming process. The schnorkels themselves proved troublesome, prone to mechanical failure and creating a distinctive wake that could be spotted visually. And even with a schnorkel, a U-boat's submerged speed remained too slow for effective convoy attacks. The device was a defensive measure, a way to survive, not a way to win. By mid-1944, the schnorkel had become standard equipment, but by then the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond salvage. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944 succeeded in part because German U-boats were unable to interdict the invasion fleet. Aircraft and surface ships equipped with radar created an impenetrable screen. U-boats attempting to approach the English Channel were detected and destroyed before they could launch attacks. Of the 36 U-boats dispatched to counter the invasion, more than half were sunk within days. The remainder achieved nothing. The human cost of this technological mismatch was staggering. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat force during the war, 30,000 did not survive. A 75% fatality rate, the highest of any military service in any nation during World War II. These were not abstract statistics but individual tragedies: fathers and sons and brothers who left port and never returned. Families in Germany received terse notifications: missing in action, presumed lost at sea. No bodies were recovered. No graves were dug. The ocean became their cemetery. The psychological burden on survivors was immense. Men who completed one patrol knew the odds were against them surviving a second. Those who made it through two were haunted by the knowledge that a third would almost certainly be their last. Some requested transfers to surface ships or shore duty, only to be denied. The U-boat service was perpetually short of experienced personnel. Every veteran was too valuable to release, even if keeping them meant sending them to their deaths. Diaries and letters from the period reveal the slow descent into despair. Early in the war, submariners wrote home with confidence and pride, describing their adventures and victories. By 1943, the tone had changed. Letters spoke of exhaustion, of relentless attacks, of watching other boats sail out and never return. Some men wrote farewell letters before each patrol, to be delivered if they did not come back. Others stopped writing altogether, unable to find words for what they were experiencing. One such man was Oberleutnant Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, captain of U-96. Lehmann Willenbrock was one of the most successful U-boat commanders, credited with sinking 24 ships. His boat and crew were later immortalized in the novel and film Das Boot, though dramatized and fictionalized. The real Lehmann Willenbrock survived the war, but many of his comrades did not. In post-war interviews, he described the mounting sense of futility as the war progressed. Each patrol felt less like a military operation and more like a death sentence postponed. Another voice from the depths was that of Heinz Schaefer, who served on U-977. Schaefer's boat was one of the last to surrender, famously sailing to Argentina after Germany's capitulation rather than surrendering in Europe. His memoir, written years later, described the constant fear that defined life aboard a late-war U-boat. Every sound, every shadow, every moment on the surface was fraught with tension. The ocean, once a realm they mastered, had become hostile and alien, filled with unseen threats that could strike at any moment. The Allied perspective revealed the ruthless efficiency of radar-directed anti-submarine warfare. Pilots and naval officers described hunting U-boats as almost routine by 1944. Aircraft would take off on patrol, fly their assigned sectors, and monitor their radar screens. When a contact appeared, the procedure was standardized. Approach at high speed from the target's blind spot, usually from astern or directly ahead where lookouts were least effective. Illuminate the target with searchlights at the last possible moment. Drop depth charges or rockets while the U-boat was still on the surface, before it could dive. The weapons themselves had also improved. Early depth charges required a direct hit or very near miss to be lethal. By 1943, new explosives and fusing mechanisms increased lethality. A depth charge detonating within 50 feet of a submerged U-boat could rupture the hull. Rockets, fired in salvos, created a pattern of explosions that was nearly impossible to evade. Aircraft carried more weapons, dropped them more accurately, and had longer patrol endurance thanks to improved engines and auxiliary fuel tanks. Surface escorts benefited from the same technological advances. Destroyers and corvettes were equipped with improved sonar, radar, and more effective depth charge projectors. The Hedgehog, a forward-throwing weapon that launched multiple small bombs in an arc ahead of the ship, proved particularly deadly because it did not require the escort to pass over the submarine's position, maintaining sonar contact throughout the attack. Coordination between aircraft and ships reached new levels of sophistication. Aircraft would locate and track a submerged U-boat, radioing its position to surface vessels that would move in for the kill. One engagement in particular illustrated the hopelessness of the U-boat's situation. In March 1944, U-801, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans Joachim Brands, was operating off the coast of West Africa. The boat had been at sea for 6 weeks with little success. Fuel and provisions were running low. Brands decided to surface at night to recharge batteries and make one final sweep of the area before returning to base. Unknown to Brands, an American Catalina flying boat was patrolling the same region. The aircraft's radar picked up U-801 at a range of 28 miles. The pilot altered course and began a slow approach, careful not to alert the submarine. At 10 miles, the aircrew could see nothing with their eyes, only the glowing blip on the radar screen steadily growing stronger. At 5 miles, the pilot descended to attack altitude. At 2 miles, he switched on the searchlight. The effect was instantaneous. U-801's lookouts, who had been scanning the darkness and seen nothing, were suddenly blinded by a beam of light so intense it seemed like daylight. Before they could react, the Catalina roared overhead, dropping 6 depth charges in a perfect straddle. The explosions lifted U-801's stern out of the water and cracked the pressure hull. Water flooded the engine room. Brands ordered an emergency surface, hoping to save his crew. But the Catalina was already circling back. As the U-boat wallowed on the surface, its decks awash and crew scrambling topside, the aircraft made a second pass, this time firing its machine guns. Bullets raked the conning tower, killing 2 men and wounding several others including Brands. The boat began to settle by the stern. Brands gave the order to abandon ship. The crew jumped into the water as U-801 slipped beneath the waves. The Catalina circled, its crew watching the survivors struggle in the water. Protocol dictated they should call for surface ships to pick up prisoners, but the nearest ship was hours away. Instead, the pilot radioed the position and remained overhead, illuminating the area with flares until a destroyer arrived shortly after dawn. Of U-801's crew of 51 men, 34 were rescued. The rest, including Brands, did not survive the hours in the water. This pattern repeated across the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean, everywhere U-boats operated. The once feared underwater predators had become prey, hunted by an enemy that could see them when they could not see back. The technological asymmetry was absolute, and it reshaped the entire character of the naval war. Yet even as the U-boat force bled to death, Berlin refused to abandon the campaign. Hitler, increasingly detached from reality as the war turned against Germany, insisted that the U-boats must continue fighting. He spoke of miracle weapons under development, new types of submarines that would turn the tide. Some of these actually existed. The Type XXI U-boat, introduced in late 1944, was a revolutionary design with streamlined hull, massive battery capacity, and underwater speed far exceeding earlier models. Had it entered service in significant numbers earlier, it might have changed the calculus. But production was hampered by Allied bombing, resources shortages, and the general chaos of Germany's collapsing war economy. Only a handful became operational, and none achieved significant success before the war ended. The desperation bred innovation, but also folly. Some U-boats were equipped with bizarre experimental systems. One boat carried a device intended to detect radar by collecting and analyzing electromagnetic emissions, a sort of passive electronic warfare suite. It never worked reliably. Another trial involved coating a U-boat in anechoic tiles, rubber sheets embedded with air pockets designed to absorb sonar pings. The tiles fell off in heavy seas, and their effect on radar signature was negligible. Other proposals never left the drawing board. Plans for U-boats powered by hydrogen peroxide, enabling high underwater speeds, remained theoretical. Designs for midget submarines and one-man torpedoes were built and deployed, but achieved little except adding to the death toll. The Kriegsmarine was throwing ideas at the wall, hoping something would stick, but the fundamental problem remained unsolved. As long as U-boats needed to surface, Allied radar would find them. And German science could not produce a submarine that did not need to surface. Meanwhile, the survivors carried on. By 1945, the U-boat war had devolved into a grim ritual. Boats sailed knowing they would likely not return, but orders were orders. Crews went through the motions, running on adrenaline and routine, their minds numbed by fatigue and fear. The wolfpack tactics of the early war were a distant memory. Now, U-boats operated alone, tasked simply with surviving long enough to sink something, anything, to justify their existence. The final months of the war saw some of the most futile operations. U-boats were ordered to attack shipping off the American coast, a mission requiring weeks of dangerous transit through waters thick with Allied patrols. Most never reached their operational areas. Those that did found targets scarce and defenses overwhelming. A few sinkings were achieved, but at catastrophic cost. For every merchant ship torpedoed in American waters in early 1945, 2 or 3 U-boats were destroyed. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, approximately 150 U-boats were still at sea. Many captains, upon receiving the order to surface, hoist black flags, and proceed to designated ports for internment, chose instead to scuttle their boats. They could not stomach the idea of handing over their vessels to the enemy, or perhaps they simply could not face the reality of defeat. Explosive charges were set, seacocks opened, and crews took to lifeboats as their submarines sank into the depths one final time. Others complied with the surrender order, though with bitter reluctance. Long columns of U-boats, flying black flags of capitulation, motored into British and American ports. Crowds gathered to watch the spectacle, these once feared sharks of the sea now defanged and docile. Allied sailors boarded the German boats, disarming crews and taking control. Many U-boats were sailed to predetermined locations and scuttled in deep water as part of Operation Deadlight, ensuring they could never be used again. For the men who survived, the war's end brought not relief but a different kind of torment. They had lost. Their sacrifices had been for nothing. Comrades had died by the thousands, and in the end, Germany was occupied, divided, and destroyed. The ideology that had sent them to war was revealed as monstrous. The leaders they had trusted were dead or on trial for crimes against humanity. The survivors were left to grapple with questions that had no satisfying answers. Why had they been sent to die in a hopeless cause? Why had their leaders not recognized the futility sooner? Some turned bitter, refusing to speak of the war, burying memories that were too painful to confront. Others sought understanding, writing memoirs and giving interviews, trying to make sense of what they had experienced. A few became advocates for peace, using their stories to warn future generations about the cost of war. But all of them carried scars, invisible but deep, wounds that never fully healed. The technological dimension of their defeat became clearer in the post-war years as records were declassified and historians pieced together the full story. The cavity magnetron, the device that enabled effective airborne radar, had been developed in Britain in 1940 and shared with the United States under the Tizard mission, a scientific exchange that proved decisive. German intelligence had been aware of radar's existence but catastrophically underestimated its capabilities and the speed of Allied development. More galling was the realization that Germany had possessed the scientific knowledge to develop similar technology but had failed to prioritize it. German physicists understood microwave generation. German engineers were capable of miniaturization. But institutional inertia, bureaucratic infighting, and strategic miscalculations meant that resources were directed elsewhere. The Luftwaffe focused on aircraft production. The Army on tanks and artillery. The Navy on building more U-boats rather than fundamentally reimagining how they would be used. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.